If you think basic income sounds familiar, it is. Manitoba launched its minimum income experiment, dubbed Mincome, in the 1970s. For 4 years, residents of Dauphin received a guaranteed income, no strings attached. Well, now Ontario will revisit basic income for select residents in Hamilton, Lindsay, and Thunder Bay, a move that could improve people's quality of life and help them navigate an unpredictable labor market. One professor has studied that Mincome for decades now. Evelyn Forget is a professor of economics at the University of Manitoba. You guys really dug into this. What is the main takeaway from the study that you guys did?
Well, I went looking for some of the Mincome data several years ago. The original project had been set up to determine what the impact would be on people's labor market behavior. And some early work was done in the 1980s, which demonstrated that for most people, they didn't reduce the number of hours they worked very much at all. But there were two groups of people who did reduce hours worked. The first were secondary earners, and at the time these were married women who took time out of the workforce to give birth. And if you remember back to the 1970s, the entitlement to maternity leave at the time was about 4 weeks. So these women, in effect, used the Mincome stipend to buy themselves longer mat leaves, longer parental leaves. But the second group of people were particularly interesting, and here the language turns out to be important. If you're not a supporter of basic income, you say something like, young unattached males reduce the number of hours they worked dramatically. And if you are a supporter of basic income, you tend to say it in a slightly different way. That is that teenagers, particularly 16-year-olds, were working less. And so a few years ago, I went looking for the people who participated in the experiment at one of the sites in Dauphin. And I went specifically looking for those teenage boys. And I found them in high school because one of the consequences of the experiment was that we had a nice increase in high school completion rates, exactly coincident with the experiment. And when we talked to people who'd participated in the experiment, they told us that before Mincome came along, a lot of boys in low-income families were under a fair amount of family pressure to become self-supporting financially. When Mincome came, when basic income was introduced, their families decided they could support their sons in high school just a little bit longer.
Do you think the case for a basic income, for Mincome, as you guys call it there, has that changed over the years, and as you've watched sort of, different data groups still coming in, really?
I think it has. I think in the 1970s, the reason to look at a basic income was essentially as an anti-poverty measure. You asked me about the basic takeaway measures. I mean, I was really looking for impact on people's health and quality of life. And because there was very little support for low-income people, and particularly for the working poor, health outcomes tended to be quite poor. When basic income came along, when Mincome came along, what we found was that people were being hospitalized less often, and largely because there were fewer mental health issues. They were going to family doctors less often, again because there were fewer mental health issues. So I think at the time we were looking at basic income as a poverty reduction strategy, and I think that has shifted over the years. In the 1970s, labor markets were different than they are now. I mean, people still expected to graduate from high school or from university and to get a full-time job, to work 35 or 40 hours a week for their entire careers, to get many of their benefits through the workplace. And that isn't the case now. It's especially not the case for young people entering the workforce who might find themselves working for years on short-term contracts, putting together 2 or 3 part-time jobs, trying to cobble together a reasonable level of income. And I think basic income is particularly well designed to fill in some of the gaps in that kind of an earning record.
So, as Ontario implements this basic income plan in this province, what do you think they should be keeping in mind from the Manitoba experiment, from the plan there, what we've learned and how it can apply to what we're trying to do in Ontario?
Well, I think we did learn quite a lot. We learned a lot about how to design a basic income, and we learned a lot about creating incentives and in particular not introducing disincentives to things like work. And I think that's something they'll pay attention to. But I think the other thing that they ought to be paying attention to is the very broad range of measures that are affected by income level and in particular by income security. I focused on health because that was the kind of data I had. I looked at education because I was interested, but you can imagine a whole range of social policies and programs that would be influenced if we could if we could do something about poverty up front, so to speak, to take some of the dollars we currently spend treating the consequences of poverty and put them around the other end and give people the resources they need to live reasonable lives.
And to what extent, I mean, just sort of, peripherally interesting, is there now going to be this new treasure trove of data because we can sort of, watch it, how it rolls out here in a different province, in different circumstances, slightly, but a different environment. How important is that treasure trove of data in terms of sort of figuring out more about this, how it works, and how we can build these things to work better?
I think it's tremendously important. As a researcher, you're always looking for great new sources of information about how it is that people behave. But the kind of data that we have access to now is so very different from the kind of data that was available in the 1970s. The kinds of resources that are available to us, the amount of data that's collected routinely in the processing of administrative tasks, even computerization. I mean, if you think back to the way data was collected in the 1970s and the way people interacted with the computer environment, you can imagine the much harder time researchers would have had managing that data in the 1970s. So I think there are some tremendous opportunities, both to fine-tune the idea of a basic income, but also to apply to all kinds of other social programs.
And do you think there is, presuming that this is a success in Ontario, is there yet a sort of larger, more effective case for this basic income plan to go national?
I think there's a very strong case for a basic income, and I think I've been saying for a long time that the world is sort of inevitably moving. High-income countries are inevitably moving, I think, towards a situation where a basic income is a part of the social safety net that exists out there. I think that's inevitable. What I'm not sure is about timing. It's much harder to talk about the political process, I think, of introducing a very different way of dealing with some of these social policies.
We're going to leave it there, but it's such an interesting perspective with so much fascinating history to this. It's really great to get you on. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much.
Evelyn Forget, Professor of Economics at the University of Manitoba.